even the early days of 2022, almost up to the end, up until the day of the invasion. We know that Putin did try to avoid this outcome, and Merkel. Interestingly, Merkel does confirm this. I mean, she does confirm that, look, at the end of the day, Putin was committed to peace, and was committed to avoiding this war through diplomatic means. She's very clear about this.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I've got the privilege of talking to a colleague in Europe, to Thomas Fazi, who's a journalist, a writer, a translator, and a socialist. And Thomas is a colleague from a group that I'm part of, and they recently told me that Thomas went through the work of reading the 700-page memoirs of Angela Merkel that she just published, and that is quite a big deal, and I don't think I can do that to myself. So I thought I'm going to ask Thomas about what he read in that work, how Angela Merkel portrays herself, and what we learn about her time in power. That's what we're here for today. So Thomas, welcome to the show.
Hi, Pascal. Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for volunteering to do this, because it's a huge work, and it's called Freedom.
That's right.
Can you tell us, first and foremost, what you thought of the book, your overall impression, and then maybe why did she call it Freedom?
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, it's not an easy read. It's not a light read, as one might imagine. Let's just say that prose writing isn't probably Merkel's strongest suit. In a sense that it's exactly what you'd expect from Merkel. It's full of very detailed descriptions, and she gets bogged down in a lot of often even quite useless details, and honestly, a large part of the book I found not particularly interesting. So when she talks about many of the crises that she faced as a chancellor, so the Euro crisis and then the migration crisis in 2015, etc., she doesn't really offer much in terms of sort of a behind-the-scenes look at what was happening. Most of it is just Merkel trying to defend her track record on those crises. And but what I found most disappointing is that she defends most of those choices in kind of moral or idealistic terms, which comes across as a bit disingenuous. I mean, I'm not saying that she wasn't acting in good faith in the way she faced those crises. I mean, I'm willing to give it a benefit of the doubt, but at the same time, when you're reading a memoir of arguably the most powerful German chancellor of the time in European history, I mean, you also want some insight into the sort of deeper structural dynamics, the economic dynamics, the political dynamics that were happening behind the scenes, and that maybe led her to make certain decisions. And instead, a lot of her decisions, for example, throughout the Euro crisis, are really justified in terms of I was just doing what I thought was best for Europe and for Germany, and working within the constraints of German parliamentary politics. But ultimately, I was just driven by a desire to save the blessed European project, and I'm glad to say that we succeeded in the end. And similarly, on the migration crisis, it's all her decisions are justified on purely humanitarian grounds. So you get the feeling that there's something missing there. Clearly, her management of those crises was about more than just her feelings and her desire to do what she felt was best for either these poor migrants or for the European project as a whole. Clearly, she was also acting on behalf of certain interests, national interests, vested interests. Clearly, we know how much German banks benefited from the sort of the German-led management of the euro crisis, et cetera, et cetera. But there is one exception in the book, and that is her coverage of the Ukraine crisis. That, on the other hand, I found very interesting. And I think it's not a coincidence. I think that's because Merkel herself admits that on that issue, Russia in particular, but foreign policy more in general, she adopted very much a realist approach, a realpolitical, as she says, approach, which is why that part of the book is actually interesting and actually reveals quite a bit about what was really going on behind the scenes, because she doesn't try to sugarcoat her policies in moral or idealistic terms as she does on almost every other issue. On this issue, she's very clear. Foreign policy, I mean, she comes across as very much a kind of instinctive realist. I don't think she read the literature. I don't think she read Mersheimer, but she comes across as an instinctive realist, as every politician should be when it comes to foreign policy, right? Even if you haven't read the literature, that's just a common sense approach to foreign policy. And so the first thing you get is just how much, I mean, compared to those that have come after her, reading her talk about foreign policy is just like a breath of reason and common sense and just intelligence, really. Even though you realize that she's not saying anything particularly, genius. But of course, compared to what we have now in Europe, just her general approach to foreign policy comes across as an adult, just an adult who is talking about foreign policy and Russia and these issues, compared to what we have now, which I wouldn't even know how to describe, psychologically and mentally damaged, in charge of European policy. So just to give you an example, because I think it's important to hear this from our own mouth. So what you get is that Merkel, already more than 10 years ago, even 15 years ago, clearly had a pretty good grasp of the fact that the geopolitical balance of power was shifting globally. And she talks about this quite a lot in the book. So she already says how this global balance of power was shifting away from the West and towards at the time, really emerging BRICS bloc. And she also says that, unfortunately, the United States struggled with relinquishing power. And she cites, for example, the demand for reforms of international institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank that were blocked, demands that were coming from countries like Russia and China, which were systematically blocked by the US. And she in the book, she says that she regretted that because she favored a much less sort of moral-driven approach and a much even less kind of hegemonic approach and a much more pragmatic approach. And so, she says that my view of foreign policy is that, it's a big world and you've got a lot of countries with different, civilizational values and economic models. And we can't try to impose our model on everyone. So the best we can do is try to work together based on mutual interests. That's kind of this is how she explains her foreign policy worldview, which might come across as a bit crude, but at the end of the day, it makes sense. I mean, I think this, in very general terms, is how countries should approach foreign policy. So she comes across as as having a very healthy understanding, I think, of what of how one should navigate foreign policy. And she makes the example of China. She speaks quite a bit about China, and she's got quite. Of course, she says yes. That's an oppressive system, and blah blah blah. But it exists. Obviously it exists. We're talking about a huge economy, a huge civilization. Of course, we have to engage with China. So her book is full of these kind of basic commonsensical arguments, which come across as incredibly radical in today's context. Even though she comes across as just a as just someone who hadn't yet fallen prey to the madness that has swept across the West today.
That is something that I've been wondering about Angela Merkel for a while, because on the one hand, she's the chancellor who clung to Nord Stream, which just was objectively in the interests of Germany to have cheap access to Russian oil, but that was something she had to defend, especially against the Americans, right? And she did that
Sure.
until she left. On the other hand, and she's the chancellor who, together with Hollande, François Hollande of France, sat down with Petro Poroshenko and Vladimir Putin, and basically, the four of them in the Normandy format, they hammered out that kind of the agreements built on Minsk that then was supposed to lead to a peace and reconciliation process in Ukraine. But then again, she's also the person who, after she stepped down and handed over the reins in December 2022, actually gave an interview, I think it was to Die Zeit, and said, "Oh, we just did that in order to buy time for Ukraine." And if that's really what she did, then, well, that's just like, I mean, I then understand why the Russians felt that they were stabbed in the back. And if it's not true, that's also an option, that she's just trying to kind of ride the wave of the current, the wave of Russophobia and everything, and just tries to justify her actions retroactively in the new framework. In the book, did you
Right.
find any clues on which one it was? How does she try to portray that moment? Is she clinging to this idea that it was just buying time to arm Ukraine, or was there a real hope that it would lead to something? Which I think there was. I don't think that Angela Merkel of 2014, 2015, or 15, 16 actually wanted this kind of escalation. That's a personal impression.
Right. So I've never been convinced with this interpretation of that famous Die Zeit interview. So in writing this article, I went back to the original German interview. And so what she states in the interview is, this is all she says about it. And then people, built upon that. But these are literally the only two things she says about the Minsk agreements. She says the Minsk agreements were an attempt to give Ukraine time, and that Ukraine used this time to get stronger, as you can see today. So this is all that she says in the interview. So, I mean, she doesn't exactly say this was all that Minsk was about. So I don't think that what she's saying is Minsk was just a way to allow for Ukraine to buy time. But most importantly, nowhere in the interview does she say, I was in on this plan. So even assuming that what she's saying is this is what the plan was, nowhere in the interview, I think, does she even give any indication really that that this is how she viewed the Minsk agreements. So this was my understanding at the time. When the interview came out, everyone started saying, oh, here's Merkel admitting that it was just one big ploy to allow for Ukraine to rearm in order to then go for a kind of military solution to the conflict. To me, that never really made much sense. I mean, the idea that Merkel somehow would have wanted this war never really sat that well with me. I mean, I couldn't wrap my mind around that. Why would Merkel have wanted this war? I mean, she and Germany literally had nothing to benefit from this war, as has become apparent ever since. And so the idea that Merkel was in on some secret plan to allow Ukraine to buy time in order to then wage all-out war on Russia, or at least pick Russia out of the Donbas and potentially, I don't know, even Crimea, never really made much sense to me. And in fact, she speaks a lot about the Minsk agreements and the whole peace process in the book. And the feeling you get from reading the book, and honestly, I mean, the reconstruction sort of rings as pretty sincere to me, is that she really did try, I think, to avoid war. She dedicates a lot to talking, again, often in almost too much detail, about the Minsk agreements. And you really do get the feeling that she did not at all see it as a ploy to just allow Ukraine to buy time. In fact, nowhere in the book does she even hint at that possibility, which is kind of weird. I mean, so at the time, I also read that interview as a way of kind of retroactively justifying her position, which by then had come under very intense criticism. You know, her supposed appeasement with Russia, and should at best be read as just Merkel kind of trying to retroactively justify what she did. But then, you know, why, if she was trying to sell this story, why is it nowhere to be found in the book? Especially given, you know, the echo that that interview had. So I think that was just something she said, you know, on the spur of the moment. But then when she sat down to tell this story, she you know, she goes to a very she clearly makes a big effort to make the case that she really believed in the Minsk agreements. And but what she says and often implies is that there were very powerful forces in the US, in Ukraine, and even in Europe. She often mentions Poland, but also the Baltic countries, that wanted a military solution to this conflict and were not interested in peace. She makes this, you know, she says this quite clearly. She explains how very early on the Obama administration was already putting pressure on other NATO countries, basically saying, these agreements, they're not going anywhere. So, you know, we think that we're going to start providing at least defensive weapons to Ukraine. And Merkel, and again, I'm going to maybe quote a passage. I mean, she explains in the book that she was strongly opposed to this idea of sending even just defensive weapons, because she understood that and I'm quoting from the book, any delivery of weapons would strengthen the forces within the Ukrainian government who hoped only for a military solution, even if that offered no prospect of success. In other words, she understood very well that this would embolden the extremist and ultra-nationalist neo-Nazi factions within Ukraine that wanted war. And we know that these factions were very adamant about about their opposition to the Minsk agreements. And of course, you know, you can also infer from the book that Merkel is saying these forces also aligned with kind of US interests in many respects, and because she understands that that there were powerful forces even in the US, that and so she understands that she sees this alliance forming between ultra-nationalist factions in Ukraine, pro-war factions in the US, pro-war factions in Europe, and in fact, you know, she says that she realizes very early on that there's not much hope of these agreements working, because, of course, if you don't have the US on board, you know, and again, she doesn't say this openly, but there's a lot that you can infer and you can read through the lines. And she clearly says, look, if the US isn't on board with peace, like, I can't do this by myself. Me and France, we can't do this by ourselves, you know, and not even, and importantly, she understands that not even the Ukrainian government can do this by itself, even if, and of course, Poroshenko is a different animal, but it's pretty clear that even from what she says, but that's also what I've always believed, that, for example, that Zelensky at first at least was committed to the agreements. And Merkel says this quite clearly. She says, you know, he was elected on a peace platform and he believed in it. And at first, he really did want to try to put an end to this. But again, he immediately came under very intense pressure from, again, extremist factions within Ukraine. And he received no support from the US in terms of going forward with the agreements. But I think something that Merkel sort of returns to quite often in the book is this idea, which of course has proven true, but many had already predicted at the start of the conflict, at the start of the invasion, but even before that, is this idea that there is simply no way that Ukraine could ever have won this on the battlefield. So again, Merkel proves to have a pretty good grasp also of kind of basic military strategy in a way. I don't know if this was something that a conclusion that she came to herself or she was advised by people who understood military strategy, but this is something that she returns to very often in the book. So for example, this is something that she says she told the first post 2014 coup government. And she says that, she emphasized the fact that a resolution would not be possible without dialogue and diplomacy. And she emphasized, and I'm quoting, that this did not mean that Ukraine must not defend itself, but ultimately diplomatic solutions must be found, because I could even go as far as to say there will be no military solution. End of quote. This is what she says she told the government that came to power in the first Ukrainian government that came to power in 2014. And this is something she often says in the book, that there can't be a military solution to this, and there definitely can't be a military solution in Ukraine's favor. So overall, the impression I got from the book is that, in fact, she really did try to avoid this war. I think she did her best. Well, that's maybe going a bit too far. Could she have done more? Probably yes. Could she have been more adamant about it? Could she have made more of a fuss about it? Yes, I'm sure there's a lot more she could have done potentially to try to avoid this. But at the same time, I think, especially in light of what happened after, this isn't something that Germany could have stopped by itself. I think, and I'm not speaking as a Merkel fan, but I think it's pretty clear that, even assuming that she was completely in good faith and wanting to avoid this war, and even assuming that she did all that she could have, I think it's pretty clear that she couldn't have stopped this all by herself, especially, I repeat, if the US had other plans. And again, when it comes to the other plans, she also says quite a bit, especially when talking about Nord Stream. There's some interesting passages about Nord Stream in the book. So obviously she defends Nord Stream on very basic kind of, economic grounds, but not only. So, and again, I return to Merkel's sort of general approach to Russia, which was, and I'm going to quote here because I found it particularly interesting. And a point where she says, many Central and Eastern European countries seem to wish that their gigantic neighbor would just disappear from the map, simply cease to exist. But of course, Merkel understood that Russia, and I'm quoting again, Russia did exist, and it was armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. There was no wishing it away geopolitically, and there still isn't. One might not have liked Putin, but that didn't make Russia disappear from the map. End of quote. So, and she often returns to the fact that this is a massive country armed with thousands of nuclear weapons. So it's clear that for her, Nord Stream was clearly motivated by basic sort of German national economic interests, but she also clearly viewed Nord Stream as a tool of diplomacy, of peace diplomacy, if you want. She understood that increasing economic interdependence was also in Europe's wider security interest because it minimized the risk of conflict. And I think this is something that is quite well understood, even in the literature. I mean, she had a point. So this idea that she somehow contributed to what happened by doing the Nord Stream deal, and especially Nord Stream 2, just makes no sense whatsoever. How would that have contributed to what happened? If anything, clearly Russia having clearly through Nord Stream, I mean, Nord Stream also meant that not only Germany, but also Russia had less of an interest in going to war with Europe. To me, this is pretty clear. And we know that Russia went to great lengths to avoid this war. And other interesting point, Merkel confirms this in the book. Merkel confirms on more than one occasion in the book that Putin was committed to the Minsk agreements. So he says, yeah, whenever we met, Putin would start, ranting about NATO and this and that, and we would just let him talk because that's what he does. That's his gist. But he would always conclude all his rants with, but we understand that diplomacy is the only way forward, which is why we are committed to these agreements. And again, this aligns with a lot of reconstructions that historians have done, beginning with Mersheimer and many others, who have been very clear about the fact that even according from their reconstruction, it's pretty clear that Putin did his best to avoid this war. We know all the openings he did to all the attempts he made to engage diplomatically with the US all the way up to literally, the end of 2021, even the early days of 2022, almost up to the end, up until the day of the invasion. We know that Putin did try to avoid this outcome. And Merkel, interestingly, Merkel does confirm this. I mean, she does confirm that, look, at the end of the day, Putin was committed to peace, and was committed to avoiding this war through diplomatic means. She's very clear about this. And in fact, there's one sort of behind the scenes story, and sorry, then I'll shut up, that she tells, which I didn't know about, and I've read a lot about this conflict, but I didn't know that when is it exactly? She says that, so basically, these are the last months of her chancellorship, so mid-2021. She says that she proposed a European Council meeting with Putin. So I think we're talking about mid-2021.
So that's around
which
the
never
time when
happened because
Putin met.
Poland, Estonia, and Lithuania.
That's around the time when
proposed
Putin met with Biden, isn't it? Like that was summer 2021 in Geneva.
Yes, I think that's more or less when this happened. But I found it very interesting that even at that point, when relations were very, very, very strained, she was still trying to get them all into a room. And it's interesting how Merkel often emphasizes, like, for example, Merkel, she says, and maybe this is, her reading too much into it, but I think, anyone that understands human nature probably understands that maybe there's some truth to what she says. So she attributes a big responsibility to what happened, also to the pandemic, to COVID. So to the fact that no one was meeting in person anymore. So Merkel had this very kind of old school approach to diplomacy and international relations, which is you get around a table and you work things out all through the night. This is how she managed the Euro crisis. You'll remember they would have these like meetings through the night, and she goes over this in the book as well, and then in the morning after 15 hours, they would come out and they'd, hatch some kind of agreement. And she remembers, similar encounters with Putin throughout the years, sort of really sitting down and really trying to work things out face to face. And she attaches a lot of importance to this kind of old school face-to-face diplomacy. And so she says that, she literally says COVID was like the nail in the coffin of the Minsk agreements. And that's I would say probably reading too much into it. But still, I think it offers an interesting insight into sort of her approach to diplomacy, and clearly it was I would say a healthy approach in sort of general terms, especially compared to what we have now, which is, well, zero diplomacy basically. So
No,
yeah,
but
yeah.
yeah, that does make sense to me, and you could just help me clarify quite a bit because Merkel struck me as somebody who was rather pragmatic, even if not a downright realist. And let's not forget, like people like Mersheimer and so on, the realists, they didn't only retrospectively try to make sense out of Putin. They proactively, before everything happened, predicted, look, if this is the trajectory, then war will be the outcome. And they ended up being right. And in this sense, I think Merkel is one of the people who maybe instinctively saw this. And when she, maybe it's not even a bad thing that she points out also the pandemic and so on, because sometimes we want to attribute too much power to individuals, like to Joe Biden or to Zelensky, who are responsible for what happens. But it's more the amalgamation of like a lot of factors coming together, all at certain times, which then push things into one direction. So, do
Yeah.
you think that her coming out with this book now, although like writing a book of 700 pages, even if she had ghostwriters and so on who helped, that was a lot to do. But the timing now, when the Ukraine war is about to basically to be lost, at least to a good extent. One could argue this is opportunistic. Then again, this thing has to had to be completed probably in summer in order to be out now. And the media narrative about Ukraine has been very, very strongly pro. Well, Ukraine is winning. We're just waiting for it to happen, right? Do you interpret this as kind of a brave kind of thing to say at this point in time, coming out with all of these thoughts on the Ukraine war, or does it still
Mhm.
make sense to you within the overall um, propaganda narrative that we are living in?
No, it very much goes against the official narrative. It goes, and clearly, obviously, she has an interest in contrasting that narrative because that narrative has been used to attack her legacy and accuse her of being, in fact, as I was saying, even one of the main culprits of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I mean, the stuff that's been said about all this is outrageous. Not to mention Nord Stream. And so I think I interpret the book as being Merkel trying to sort of clean up her legacy in a way. And
Even against
and
the current zeitgeist, the current narrative. Although if I mean, she's a smart person, so she probably sees ahead and sees that in 5 to 6 years, people will think differently about this time, and
well,
it.
look, I mean, she's got what has she got to lose? I mean, she's not in politics anymore. She's, pretty much retired. I think it makes sense even from a human and psychological standpoint that what she is most interested in is saving her legacy, is saving her political legacy, even if that means going against the established narrative on Ukraine. As you say, it's also true that the narrative is shifting. And so I think, I wouldn't be surprised if Merkel is feeling a bit of, Schadenfreude, if that is the correct pronunciation, and seeing what's happening because, we know, I mean, in fact, it's already clear that history has proven her right. A lot of what she says in the book is clearly already proven to be true. When she says there's no way there can be no military solution, there can be no military victory for Ukraine. This is simply impossible. Hence, we have to go for diplomacy. This has clearly been proven true. When she says that Nord Stream made sense from an economic standpoint, we know the dramatic consequences that decoupling from Russian gas have had for Germany. She's also been proven right. So I think in this sense, I think history will, at least as far as her Russia policy goes, will look upon Merkel quite kindly. And so I think her legacy will be it'll be the war hawks that will go down in history, assuming there will be a future with future historians, will go down in history as ones that led us into an absolute tragedy. And I think Merkel will come across as someone who tried to avoid this disastrous outcome for straightforward, and not just for straightforward economic reasons, but also because she understood. And again, she says this in the book. She understood that a Europe-Russia or NATO-Russia conflict is pure madness. I mean, she doesn't even go too much into that in the book. She just assumes it as just basic common sense, which this was sort of the commonsensical understanding of this until not too long ago. Until Merkel is just like, sometimes she almost seems baffled by what's happening. I mean, she often returns to this idea, to this fact that this is a massive neighbor sitting right next to us, armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. Why would anyone even think that it makes remotely sense to want to go to war with Russia? I mean, sometimes she almost comes across as being naive in this respect, in the sense that she doesn't, this is not a strategic calculation that she makes. It's just kind of sort of a basic commonsensical view. And I think if one wants to, find a weak point in this whole in Merkel's reconstruction of what happened, it's her approach to Ukraine pre-2014. So, and I think this was probably more sort of a failure of strategic thinking on Merkel's part. But she admits that she played an important role in trying to draw Ukraine into the EU orbit. She admits that she played a big role in pushing for Yanukovych to sign the EU-Ukraine partnership agreement, and more, and she seen, you get no hint in the book that she understood just how much this contributed to what later happened, to how much trying to force Ukraine to make a binary geopolitical and even civilizational choice between the West and Russia, how that would end up dividing and fracturing the country, which of course is exactly what happened. I mean, we know what triggered the Euromaidan events. It was the Yanukovych government pulling out of the EU-Ukraine economic agreement, and so in this respect, she kind of was, I would say, indirectly responsible for what happened. I don't think, again, that this was an outcome that she wanted, but this was definitely at the very best a strategic and a very serious strategic miscalculation on Merkel's behalf, to the extent that that agreement played an absolute key role in triggering the events that then led to the 2014 coup that kickstarted all this. So right. on that, she does bear a lot of responsibility, even though she doesn't seem to even be aware of that in the book, or at least she doesn't admit to it in the book. In fact, she keeps accusing Russia of trying to force Ukraine to make a binary choice, when in fact it was very much the opposite. I think Russia understood that Russia was also aware of the consequences of trying to force Ukraine to make this binary choice. And in fact, I think they were looking for a triangulation between, Ukraine, the EU, and Russia itself. It was very much the European Union that was presenting this as a zero-sum
Yeah.
choice for Ukraine. That's always been my understanding, at least. And so, in this respect, Merkel did contribute to what happened after. But that said, once the train was in motion, I think she did her best to avoid, to avoid the worst possible outcome. But
Yeah.
clearly failed.
Well, I thought after this discussion I don't need to read the book anymore, but now I'm realizing I have to read her in her own words as well in order to get all of this. Um, but thank you very much for your assessment. I mean, it's valuable to hear how you read her words. Everybody, I will put links to the book and I will put links to Thomas. Thomas, where can people find you if they want to read more from you?
I'm on Substack and X mostly. So yeah, they can just Google me.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'll put all the links into the descriptions of this video. Thomas Fazi, thank you very much for your analysis today.